Welcome to the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm Bryan.
And I'm Jim Reske.
We're gospel addicts because we believe the gospel of Jesus isn't just good news, it's the best news ever.
We're addicted to the gospel because it doesn't just start us out in the Christian life, it is the Christian life.
Join us as we look at the Bible through the lens of the gospel.
Thanks so much for listening.
Hey, welcome back to the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm Bryan, joined with my co-host Jim Reske. Tonight we are going to be discussing the book of Jeremiah. I'm going to be teaching it at a men's Bible study in a few days from now. And so we like to get together, Jim and I, and just kind of talk about some of the big themes that we see in our preparation for the study. And then we broadcast the actual lesson that we give, and then sometimes we started a trend of broadcasting the lesson we wish we would have given.
That's
so
right.
Jim, before we get started, how are you doing tonight?
Well, I'm doing great, Greg. It's so great to talk to you about this, and kind of want to hear how your prep is going and where you are, the things you're learning, things you're as you start reading and commentaries and rereading Jeremiah just to get ready to speak on it next week. And so it kind of love to hear where things stand.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because we were just talking beforehand that 2 years ago you taught on this book. You were given the assignment to teach on Jeremiah and Lamentations in
Right.
in a 1 hour Bible study. This coming Saturday, I've just been given that I think we wisely cut the book of Jeremiah into two parts. So I'm doing chapters 1 through 33. And then someone else is teaching on the end of the book of Jeremiah, because the book of Jeremiah is like the longest book of the Bible. Did you know that?
No.
Yeah, it's got the most words. And so I'm a bit overwhelmed. I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed because there's so much material to cover, and it's not written in chronological order, so it can be confusing. It's not my favorite type of literature to read, or maybe just because it's so wordy and so it's hard to know who because it's not put in, a order. It can be challenging to be like, okay, who's this message to? Who's he delivering this to? What's the But at the same time, I want to start out by just saying Jeremiah is underrated.
Underrated.
He's underrated. It's one of the most underrated books of the Bible. He's one of the most underrated prophets of the Bible. And I get this in some of my research. I read that there are so few commentaries written on the book of Jeremiah, like,
Really?
compared to like Daniel or
Isaiah.
Yeah, I mean, it just, there's not, in comparison to other books of the Bible, there's not much. Not many people have taken deep dives into the book of Jeremiah.
No kidding. Well, is that
And
because
I think as a person, he's underrated because he's known as the weeping prophet.
Right? That's what I was going to ask. You think that's why? Because it's kind of, look, in some ways. Do you remember when you taught on Joshua, and the next week I had to teach after you on Judges?
Yeah.
I said, Greg got the upside story and I got the downside. Well, you got the upper. You got the feel good story from Joshua. It's all about victory and manna for, God's. It wasn't manna for God's own heart. That's obviously David. But I mean, Joshua is just such a great character. Then I'm like how it all falls apart in Judges. It's such a downer. So maybe that's.
Yeah. So last week the Bible study was on Isaiah.
Yeah.
And then going from Isaiah to Jeremiah is sort of a similar type of thing.
Yeah, it is, right. The contrast. But maybe that's why commentators say, let someone else write a book about that.
Yeah. It is. It's not the most encouraging message, is it?
Well, but it's so critical. So like you said, 2 years ago, I taught on this. And by the way, for the listeners who may not be familiar, so Greg and I are in the Bible study. the whole approach is we read through the Bible, not in 1 year, which is pretty common. You find books, walk through the Bible and things. We take 2 years. But the Bible study has been doing this for 20 years, going through it again and again and again. And the patterns have varied a little bit, but now it's on a regular rhythm of every 2 years. So 2 years ago was my first time teaching at the Bible study. This is the 2-year mark. And I taught on this book, and I learned a lot. Since I think I lost complete track of time because I was supposed to do Jeremiah and Lamentations, as you said, but I never did get to Lamentations because I just lost track of time. It's poor time management on my part. But I remember that it's kind of a down message, but it feels like it's so necessary because it deals all with our sin and our sin problem and our lack of awareness of our sin problem.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so Jeremiah is one of these guys in the Bible that you really don't want to, you don't feel bad that you didn't have the same calling as him, right? Job is probably another one.
Right.
Mean, there's guys that you kind of like envy their lives.
Yeah.
And then there's guys that you're like, whew, man, I'm glad I didn't have his experience.
That's
and
exactly.
Jeremiah had a tough ministry, but the book starts out in all of chapter 1 is about his call to the ministry, which is pretty significant that a whole chapter is devoted to it. And it's very clear. God makes it very clear to us that he was called to be a prophet before he was even born. Yeah. Now, he was born into a priestly family.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He came from a priestly line, so he could have been a priest and probably should have been a priest. But then God calls him to be a prophet. In fact, as a young man, God tells him, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you and appointed you a prophet to the nations. What is that? Verse 5, chapter 1, verse 5. So, but then Jeremiah, gets his calling as a young man. He's probably like a teenager or something. And he says, oh, but I don't even know how to speak because I'm just I'm just a youth. And then, God says, don't worry about it because I'm going to be with you and I'm going to give you the words to say. And then there's this interesting verse in verse 9. It says, then the Lord put out his hand and touched my mouth. And the Lord said to me, behold, I have put my words in your mouth. See, I have set before you this day over the nations and over kingdoms. That all sounds great. I mean, what an amazing experience. Basically, God touched his mouth and, which it reminds me, if God's called you to do something, he will provide for you. He will take care of you. He will give you all the tools necessary to fulfill that calling. And so here he's telling Jeremiah, maybe you thought you were going to be a priest, but I've called you to be a prophet. And so, and just to show you, I'm going to touch your mouth and every word that comes out of your mouth is going to be from me. But then what's interesting, Jim, is the rest of that verse, verse 10. This is his calling. This is what his ministry is going to look like: to pluck up and to break down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant. Okay, so there's 6 things mentioned there. 4 out of the 6 are negative. Basically, he's saying, okay, this is what I've called you to do: to pluck up and to break down, to destroy and to overthrow. It's like, man, what a tough ministry. And sure enough, the rest of the book, it covers a span of 40 years, shows just how tough a ministry it was for him.
So, Greg, you're in full-time ministry. Can you imagine what it would be like? People always talk about feeling the call of ministry. And I know there's probably a moment in your own life you look back and say, I felt the call of ministry to do what I do full-time and devote my life to it. And anyone in your role can reflect back on that moment, but can you compare that to, like, if God himself, I mean, what an unbelievably unique moment. So when just as you read those verses out loud, I was thinking at that moment, there must have been an unbelievable sense of elation, right? Like not just, I mean, many people have felt the call to ministry, but how many have been like where God personally says, I'm going to touch your lips and I'm going to personally call you, right? So it's amazing. So the feeling of elation, joy, exuberance, and then like you said, but some sense of foreboding with those 4 out of the 6 words having that tone, thinking, oh wow, okay, what am I getting myself into here? What is God getting me into here?
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't imagine I couldn't imagine having a call to ministry, a ministry assignment as difficult as Jeremiah had. And I don't know how you would keep yourself from being discouraged. Maybe the only way you could is knowing that the Lord himself, put this in your life. And
Yeah. Well, and even today, we know people with really tough mission assignments. There are people that we've known that have ministered like in Muslim countries where there's very little fruit. It's very difficult. But even in European countries where it feels like the church has long been dead and there's not much spiritual life. And I just know people have ministered in some Western developed countries that feel like they've been banging their heads against a wall trying to share the gospel for years. And it's like, oh, this is what God's called me to. And maybe the fruit, if I can lead one person to the Lord and then they lead someone, maybe generations from now, they'll say it was because they did that hard work in ministry, but it can still feel like you're banging your head against a wall, even today in those situations.
That's true. And then not only did he give him this difficult call, where saying 2/3 of your ministry is going to be negative. In chapter 16, verse 2, he tells him, God says to him, I don't want you to marry anybody.
Right.
Because I don't want you to marry. I don't want you to have children. And somehow that's like a living illustration of how upset God is at Judah.
Oh, really?
Well, yeah, because it's like, Jeremiah, I don't want you to bear any fruit, the fruit of children.
Oh.
I don't want you to be fruitful with children, because I'm trying to part of your ministry is to communicate how, because of the depth of your sin, you've been cut off.
Yeah.
And I mean, I can't imagine that. That's incredibly.
Well, then again,
so that brings up the point that the book of Jeremiah is not about his message, or it's just as much about him,
right,
messenger, as it is the message.
That's right. I remember that when I was in the commentary, I was talking about that. Like, there's so much about him personally in this book, about him, more than like a biographical kind of book, more than the other prophetic writings.
And one of the commentaries I was looking at talked about how he might have only had like 2 friends. Like, his one friend was Baruch, the guy who wrote down the scribe. And right. I don't even know who the other friend would be, but like, he didn't have any friends.
Maybe God was keeping him from being married to spare some poor woman the lifetime of being married to someone with such a miserable ministry, because of a lifetime misery. He was trying to spare some poor woman from being married to that.
Yeah, I mean, it is really.
Oh, hey, Greg, rewind a second. Go back. I think you had mentioned before that he could have been a priest. He was in a priestly family, but instead was called to be a prophet. So that obviously raises the question, since you mentioned the distinction, what is the difference between a priest and a prophet? What's a priestly ministry versus a prophetic ministry? What's the difference?
Well, in my mind, a priestly ministry would be like working in the temple, handling the sacrifices, stuff like that. Like, just like a temple work, where a prophet was somebody who's out there proclaiming, has a message for all the people.
Yeah.
And so in some ways, a priestly job would be much easier, and very much like you would think of. Well, what popped in my mind is being like a mailman or something, where you're just doing very ritualistic, like
Oh,
you're doing
yeah.
the same thing every day.
Yeah,
If you're a
right.
priest, you're just going through, where a prophet, they don't know exactly. They could be told to do all kinds of crazy stuff, which
So,
happens to Jeremiah.
in all deference to our mailman listeners out there, who I'm sure would tell you the job is challenging and different, unique every day, right? So challenges all its own. But I get the point you're making. But I think that there's like the biblical concept of the priestly role. I've heard described as more intercessory. I'm not saying that right. Like a ministry of intercession, where the priest stands between the people and God, and has like compassion on the people and comforts them, and turns to God. Like the priestly ministry is to say, God, please forgive these people. They're really trying, and have mercy on them. And the prophetic ministry is like, hey, you are dead wrong in your sins. You're dying in your sin.
Calling people out.
Calling people out. I'm gonna speak the truth to people who don't want to hear it. And because Jesus is our prophet, priest, and king, right? So there's the idea of Jesus is our priest, being the intercessory. I can't say that word right. The interceding for us. But also has a prophetic ministry of judgment, right? He's going to sit on the judgment throne. So
That's good. That's good. But you do
but I'm
see.
not sure I fully understand that. I just think that I've heard things about the distinction between that and the idea of and maybe just to your point, Jeremiah's thinking, hey, I've got a wonderful role. People like their priests, right? People like, oh, they're ministry of comfort, and it's probably much more popular to be a priest than a prophet.
Right. That's a good point. That's really good point. Well, 2 years ago you mentioned there's two big themes in Jeremiah: I will punish and I will restore.
That's right.
Those themes come out. I will punish, chapter 9 verse 25: behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will punish all who are circumcised merely in the flesh. And then the I will restore theme comes out in chapter 30 verse 17: for I will restore you to health and I will heal you of your wounds, declares the Lord. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. But it seems like the I will punish theme is the 2/3. It's a much stronger theme in the book, don't you think?
Yeah, it's almost like God is saying, I'm really, really, really mad at your sin. You're not taking it seriously. I am taking it seriously. You are really so far wrong and so far gone in your sin, but I still love you and I will restore you. Think about like when Jonah walked to Nineveh. Contrast that with that prophetic message. His whole message was like one short sentence, right? 40 days, Nineveh will be overthrown. Right? That's just the I will punish side of it. No nuance, nothing. Like you're all going to die. And they repented, actually came back. So God's message to Israel is like, I will punish sin. It will not go unpunished. You guys you have no awareness of your sin. You don't take it seriously. And it's such a theme of the Bible, such a theme of the character of God, saying, it is my universe. It is a moral universe. I wrote this law. I care about it. You are breaking my law. It is really, really serious. But I still love you. I will restore. I'll bring you back and I will find a way. Right? Even though your sin creates a separation between us, I will restore. I will bridge that gap and find a way.
That reminds me, there's a gospel illustration that comes out from a verse in Jeremiah that I've often shared with university students through the years.
Really?
And we call it the well illustration.
Really?
You may have heard of the bridge to life, right?
Yes.
The bridge to life. This is called the well illustration, and it's based on Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 13. And the way this goes is when you have a conversation, you're trying to get at Well, the way I would start it with somebody is I would say, let me ask you a question. Do you agree with this statement that people follow, give themselves to, put their trust in, whatever they believe will satisfy them and give them life? What do you think about that statement, Jim?
That sounds about right.
That people follow, they will give themselves to, they will put their trust in, whatever they believe will satisfy them and give them life.
Yeah, it'd be hard to argue with that.
Right, right. So then what I do is I take a sheet of paper and then I start drawing all these different boxes on the paper, different, like, a box of all different shapes, like a circle, an oval, a triangle. And then I'll say, brainstorm with them. What are some of those things that people are looking for to give them life? And so we talk about relationships, money, partying, career, sex, family, religion, politics, and all those different boxes. And then I'll say, you know what, this is interesting because there's a fascinating verse in the Bible, and it's in Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 13. And here's what it says. It says, my people have committed two sins. They've forsaken me, the spring of living water, and they have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water.
Explain what a cistern is for the audience.
Well, a cistern is like a holding tank, it's typically in the ground. It's built into the ground, but something, a place where you would hold water,
right?
Like a pool or something. But so then what I do is I go back to those, and what I failed to mention is, like, so I'll draw a triangle and then I'll put the word relationships in there, and then I'll draw an oval and I'll put the word, career, and then I'll draw another thing and put, all these different things that people are giving themselves to. And we look at them and we brainstorm together what those things are. Like, what do you see your friends giving their lives to? Good grades, whatever. And then after I show them this verse, I say, well, first I have to explain. We kind of talk through the verse. It says that there's two sins. What are those two sins, according to this verse? And it says that the first one is that they've forsaken God. The second one is they've dug their own cisterns. And that's kind of interesting because it shows that the complexity of sin, that it's not just turning your back on God, but they're actually digging your own cistern. Shows how much they're working to try to fill that void on their own, apart from God.
Right. I never thought of they focus on the word digging.
Yeah. So then I'll say, well, what does forsaking mean? And, they'll say, well, to abandon or to leave. And then I'll ask them about cisterns. Have you ever heard of a cistern? Do you know what it is? It's a huge container that holds water, like a big pot. And it says, and I'll say, how are the cisterns described in this verse? And it says, well, they're broken. Well, what happens when, if a pot is full of water and it's broken? It leaks, right? It becomes useless.
Right.
And so at that point, I'll draw cracks in all those little things that, the triangle, that has the word relationships. I'll draw cracks in it. Like, look, they're all broken. Yeah. These are things that people are giving themselves to, but they're broken. They're empty. They will never fully satisfy. Yeah. Are you tracking?
I am. Yeah, totally. What kind of reaction did you get from people when they saw that? Did the light bulbs go off? Did they kind of see or?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's one of these, it's almost like a pre-evangelism illustration, because it gets people to think on a deeper level. Like, what am I giving my life to?
Right.
And then what you do is you draw another, like, let's say a circle, and then you put the cross in there. And that's the one thing that doesn't have cracks in it.
Yeah.
It's the one thing, and it's like a relationship with God. Now, there might be another box called religion, and then we could talk about the difference between religion and a relationship with God.
Right, which can leak. If you're based on your moral performance, it'll always end up being leaky.
Yeah. So then I'll say, well, how is God described in this verse? And it says that he's a spring of living water. And then I'll explain, I'll go to that circle with the cross in it, and I'll make it look like a spring, like it's spurting out water. Like it's a source. It's a water source.
Right.
It's a source of life.
Right.
And so we'll talk about what's the difference between a spring and a cistern. Well, a spring produces fresh, clean, healthy water. A cistern can only hold water. And then eventually it'll get stagnant and
leaks, then it's not even doing that.
Right. So then I'll turn to some New Testament passages where like in John chapter 4.
Yeah. So the woman at the well.
Yeah, the woman at the well. John chapter 4, verses 13 and 14, where Jesus answers and says to this woman at the well, everyone who drinks this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks the water I will give him will never thirst, but the water I will give him will become in him a well of water springing up to eternal life. And so anyway, you can kind of see where this is going, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It becomes like a dialogue tool to just get them to think about what are they giving their lives to?
Right.
And so anyway, had you never heard of that before?
No, that's really good. No, I haven't seen that as an illustration. Obviously, the verse is famous. I think the verse is good, and I think it's like you described it as like almost pre-evangelism, like setting the stage for it, because people feel like, yeah, I get your religion. You just want me to, be a better person, and I don't really want to hear it. But you're starting with them saying, what do you like? Your premise that you started with is inarguable, right? You're going to give yourself to these things that you think are going to do it for you.
Yeah.
And it could be different for other people. Somebody say that person's way too wrapped up in their career. I care about family. So you're okay. Family, put that in an oval, right?
Yeah.
They're too caught up in family. I just care about the giving to the poor. Okay. So you can, causes and accomplishing great, but you have something that you're looking to.
Everybody's given their lives to something.
Everybody lives for something.
Everybody lives for something.
And so, I think that verse is so key because in your illustration, your practice, you're setting up like the key human problem is idolatry. And I think, and this would be good to research before you do the talk next week, but it feels like, I just remember when I was studying it a couple of years ago, Jeremiah feels like he does this really expansive view of sin. In other words, you could say at the time, those people could have said, look, there's the 10 Commandments. Sin is, and people do this today.
Breaking God's law,
telling a lie, hurting someone's feelings.
I haven't killed anybody, cheating on your taxes, like stealing money. Yeah. In other words, sin is discrete bad acts. Yeah.
And I haven't done those, right? I pay my taxes and I haven't killed anybody and I'm a pretty honest person. And so and they define sin so narrowly. And when he comes along and it's like this, you created you've given your life to the wrong things. You love the wrong things. Not that you do the wrong things, you love the wrong things. It's such an expansive definition of sin, right? And I think it's there in the 10 Commandments too. Like, you should have no other gods before me. It's not like he's making it up. It's not like he's creating something new, but like he's telling people, like, look, sin is your sin problem is way, way, way worse than you think it is. It's way worse than you want to admit to yourself. And you can tell yourself, I don't do these little things, so I'm fine. And that's kind of what happened in his ministry. He would point out these things they're doing, and they would come back and say, what are you talking about? What have we done? What have we done that's so bad? And they just were totally unaware of their own sin and the depth of their sin problem.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast. Feel free to contact us via email at gospeladdictpodcast gmail.com.
Stay tuned for our next episode, and remember, on your worst days, you're never beyond the reach of God's grace, and on your best days, you're never beyond the need of God's grace.
See you next time.